Hi folks, welcome to this video on transfer of skills. So this topic is to do with how one skill affects the learning of another, and that's basically what we've started with here, is a basic definition of the transfer of skills, how the learning of one skill affects, and that's the key word there. If I just need to point out, in terms of a definition, it's just affects, because it can affect it in many different ways, and that's what we're going to look at now. So in terms of positive transfer, this is where the learning of one skill helps the learning of another skill. So for example, a tennis serve is very similar to a volleyball serve, overarm serve. So the learning of one of those skills is going to help in the learning of another. A chest pass in basketball is pretty much identical to a chest pass in netball. So the learning of one skill is helping the learning of another. In contrast to that, we've obviously got negative transfer, where the learning of one skill hinders the learning of another. Now that's slightly more common than you might think, and it happens in ways that you potentially don't think. You know, you might think that playing badminton would beneficially affect, would have positive transfer on playing tennis. But the reality is, tennis is a sport where a lot of the movement is generated at the shoulder joint, whereas badminton, a lot of the movement is generated at the elbow and wrist. So actually, learning to play badminton might negatively affect your ability to play tennis, and vice versa, because you pick up bad habits. I suppose that's probably the more common sense way of putting it. We've also got, and these are two that are confusing to some people, but not just stay calm and stay with it. Proactive means we're going forwards in time. So a learned skill affects the learning of a new skill. So what we're saying there is, let's come back to the example right at the start. Let's say you have been playing volleyball and you're a good overhand volleyball server. That's your old skill, the volleyball serve. You now pick up tennis, or you now start playing tennis, and you have now transferred the learning of that old volleyball serve into the learning of a new one. In this instance, it's helped it. So that would be, proactive and positive, but it's the learning of an old skill affecting the learning of a new skill. We've also got as well retroactive transfer. So this is going back in time. And I always think of it, if someone wears retro clothing, they wear old school clothing, old fashioned clothing. So retroactive is going back in time to old skills. So the new skill affects the previously learned skill. So what if this person, having gone from volleyball to tennis, then goes back from tennis to volleyball? Will the tennis serve, although it's very similar, will it have affected their old volleyball serve? That would be retroactive transfer if there's been any effect at all. And finally, one that's quite unique is bilateral transfer. So bi is in two and lateral from one side to the other. So learning on one limb, and here's the key thing, slightly improves the learning on the opposite limb. So if I practice passing with my right foot a lot, I will actually be able to pass a little bit with my left foot, having never practiced it before. Now the reality is, it's nowhere near as effective as actually practicing on your other limb. But it does have slightly beneficial effects. If you're injured and you can't use that right foot or right arm, you can practice on your left foot or your left arm and get some bilateral transfer from one side of the body to the other. So they're the 5 key methods of transfer that take place. I know it's a bit Hollywood, but think of the film Cool Runnings. Okay, it's based on a true story, although Disney did their magic with it. You've got sprinters, okay, who didn't qualify for the Summer Olympics, so transferred over to the skill of bobsledding. So what they've done there is, as sprinters, looking at bobsledding, you're looking at proactive transfer, okay? So you've got potential for proactive as they go from sprinting to, I'll put bobsled, okay? That's proactive. Did it work out for them? It did. They became good bobsledders. So it was also positive transfer. What happened afterwards as well is some of them went from bobsled, when the Winter Olympics were over, back to sprinting. So again, what you've got an example of there is retroactive transfer. And here's where it gets quite interesting. Some of them reported that they found sprinting easier, having done bobsled training, because you were having to shift a heavy sled. So some of them reported it was positive. However, some of them said that the technique of running, pushing a bobsled had messed up their technique so badly. Your arms don't move when you don't pump at the shoulders when you're pushing a bobsled. So some of them reported it actually had a negative transfer effect on their sprinting technique. And this is the thing, it's neither one nor the other. In definite cases, we're just looking at the different types and how it can impact on performers. And the key thing about this is, positive is always helping, negative is always hindering, but proactive and retroactive, it might help, it might hinder. It doesn't have to, certainly do one. Proactive is simply the old skill into the new skill, sprinting into bobsledding, and retroactive is the new skill back into the old skill, bobsledding back into sprinting. Some of them reported positive, some of them reported negative. So it's just making sure you give the right word to the right type of transfer. What are we asked to do as coaches and teachers and things like that is to do what these three pictures basically represent. We're constantly doing transfer, aren't we? What we've got here is we've got, primary school students, they're just practicing basic throwing and catching techniques. And, what we sometimes call foundation skills. And what we then do with that is we start to then build, as the children get older, we start to build sport-specific skills onto their more complex skills. And hopefully over time, as we do that, we start to generate elite kind of skills and we get our athletes performing at the highest possible level. But the thing we need to say here is that this is all based on, I'm just going to turn back to the pen, we must have positive transfer if we want that to take place. No one is going to make it elite if we're picking up bad habits and things like that. So this is all dependent on the generation of positive transfer. Now that requires setting up realistic practice conditions. So you're giving them, if you want to think of it another way, sport-specific practice conditions so they get to practice the skill as it needs to be done in a competitive situation. If we don't get these realistic practice conditions, all we do is increase the chance of negative transfer. I'm thinking of people, a lot of swimmers, for example, will do training on the land. We'll do land-based training. And the downside to that is that, yes, you can practice and you can see the technique properly as a coach. You can see them in front of you. There's no water blocking your view. But at some stage, you're then going to put them back in the water. And what they did on the land might not be exactly what they do underwater. And so there's a risk of picking up a negative transfer. So you've always got to make sure, doing things like playing five-a-side indoors on a sports hall floor, yes, that's great. You're going to pick up a lot of the techniques and skills, but then put them on an 11-a-side pitch, grass, windy conditions, a bit boggy underfoot, wearing boots. They might not be able to do the skills to the same standard. So there's got to be some realistic practice conditions in everything that they do in order to turn these foundation skills into complex skills and then ultimately become elite. Now, as I've just said there are two things that we are absolutely obsessed with. And I say two things, it's kind of the same thing, just spoken in a different way. Ensuring that we maximise positive transfer. We want you to, have beneficial effects from one skills into others. And we want to, number two, therefore minimise negative transfer. So what we're just going to look at now very quickly is how do you maximise positive transfer and how do you minimise negative transfer? So I've just put a line down the middle, and this, obviously this side is referring to positive and this side is referring to negative, okay? And these are in no particular order, but what you've got to do if you want to get positive transfer is highlight the similarities. So if you are coaching that volleyball serve, and you've had I can't remember which way around I said it. Was it volleyball into tennis or tennis into volleyball? One of the other ways. Let's say they're a tennis player going to play volleyball. When they start with the volleyball, say, right, this is exactly the same as serving in tennis. So they've got an immediate understanding of what the body should be doing, which muscles should be contracting, which joints should be moving, and in which way. So highlight the similarities between the two techniques. You also need similar information processing. Now, what we mean by that is think about some of the skills that we looked at in terms of skill classification. So we had, for example, open and closed skills. Now, if you remember, open skills had an unpredictable environment. Lots of things can change, lots of decisions have to be made, whereas closed skills had a fixed environment. So if you want positive transfer and you're coaching an open skill, you've got to get them processing similar types of information as they're going to have to in a real competitive situation. Equally, and this is more beneficial, if you're coaching a closed skill, that isn't as important, because chances are, even if it's a closed skill, they're just concentrating on their technique, what they've done 1,000 times already, and they don't have to cope with any distractions or any changes in the environment. So it really, this similar information processing really applies in particular to that open skill. So making sure that your training copies or mimics your competitive situation as much as possible. And that's got a name. They call that the identical elements theory. Try and get identical elements in your training as to what you have in your competitive situation, and you should maximise the amount of positive transfer you're going to get. So on to negative transfer then. Now, it needs to be said that fortunately, if things are done right, this is quite rare, and usually when it does happen, it's temporary anyway. So, you know, it's not a big problem, but ideally we'd like to minimise it or eradicate it altogether. It's usually created by a misunderstanding of the movement in the first place, as opposed to actually doing things wrong and bringing the wrong elements forward from an old skill to a new skill, or a new to an old skill. So it's usually created by a misunderstanding. So when we wanted to maximise positive transfer, we highlight the similarities. In order to minimise negative transfer, highlight the differences. Here's what you don't want to do. I don't want to see you put your arm in this position or put your leg in that position. So make sure if there, that there is a definite acknowledgement that this is different in the following way. And tying in something that we've already done as well. What about these different practice methods? Don't be afraid to use these. If you think that potentially there is the risk to get negative transfer, try breaking the skill down. Do it bit by bit so that they can think about each movement, each subroutine in isolation, and gradually build it back up. So use of the whole part, whole practice methods, use of progressive part. I suppose that's what we're trying to say about the skill acquisition. If you've watched the other videos in this unit, types of skills, open, closed, all that stuff, types of practice, whole part, whole, mass distributed, transfer of skills, they are all interlinked. They are all, how do you coach skills? How do you classify them? How do you break them down? How do you teach them? How do you coach them? So when you get questions on these topics, don't be afraid to bring answers in from other topic areas, because they're all inextricably linked with each other. Finally then, there's just the one that we just need to give a bit of extra detail to. So like we said, there are the 5 practice methods: positive, negative, proactive, retroactive, and bilateral. We've looked in a little bit more detail at positive and negative. We're just going to look in a tiny bit more detail with bilateral, but we're not going to bother with proactive and retroactive. We just need to know definitions of what they are. So let's have a look at bilateral then. And as we defined earlier, make sure you keep it in your head. This is how the learning on one limb should benefit or help the learning of a skill on the other limb, the opposing limb. So I'll just put that in there in brackets to remind us that that's what we're looking at. Now we just need to introduce another term here, one that you might be familiar with: motor programs. Now motor programs is the posh name for a movement pattern stored in your long-term memory. So every move you can do is stored as a motor program in your long-term memory. You have a motor program for walking, you have a motor program for jumping, for kicking, for throwing, for heading. Any skill that you've practiced that you can do almost automatically, you have stored as a motor program in your long-term memory. And that's kind of the basis of bilateral transfer. If you've stored a movement pattern for a movement, you should be able to, in theory, transfer it from one limb to another. So if I've practiced bowling underarm with my right hand, therefore I have a motor program for bowling underarm with my right hand in my long-term memory, I should then be able to transfer it across to my left hand. It won't be as precise, it won't be as accurate, but I should be able to do it. And bilateral transfer is based on 2 things. It's based on cognitive aspects of one. So I can do bilateral transfer based on these 2 things. Cognitive is understanding of what is required. If I've got an understanding of what is required, I can transfer that motor program from one limb to another. The word cognitive, I always think of it in terms of cogs. The cogs that are wearing away in your brain. That is the worst handwriting in the world. I apologise, but there you go. The cogs wearing away in your brain. So every time you see the word cognitive, it is to do with the brain thinking about things. So in this case, the understanding of what is required, okay? So if I can understand, I can ultimately transfer that motor program from one limb to the opposite limb. Secondly and finally, if I can get an understanding of what is required, I will therefore be able to subconsciously transfer the motor program from one limb to the other. Let me give you an example. Try it if you want to. Write your name with your dominant hand and then write it with your non-dominant hand. You know, you've practiced writing your name with your dominant hand thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times probably. So you've got a motor program for writing, and in particular writing your name. How many times have you practiced writing your name with your non-dominant hand? Hardly at all, if ever. But I bet you can still do it. I bet you can still write it so it spells your name. It might be slower, it might be shakier, but you can still do it. So we can transfer the motor program from one limb to the other. And that's the basis of bilateral transfer. So that's the basis there. And there's a couple of things as well that, you know, I've mentioned this already on the first slide. It slightly improves performance on your non-dominant side. This should never be used instead of practicing on both feet or practicing on both hands or whatever. It's nowhere near as effective. What a lot of performers will do is they will do something called, I'm going to spell this wrong, they will do something called asymmetrical training, and that's practice on one limb, and they will do that until there has been some transfer, so there has been some bilateral transfer. As soon as they're happy with that, they will then do symmetrical training, which is practice on both limbs. Squeeze that in there. Okay, so you know you can do that. So a lot of people will start with asymmetrical training, just practice on the dominant side, hope for a bit of transfer to the non-dominant side, and when that's up to a basic level, that's when they'll start doing symmetrical training, actually physically practicing on both sides. So that's transfer of skills.